Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to everyone that's here, and for the organizers for the invitation, and for the very warm hospitality here in Amsterdam. This is a map of the Pacific, which we're constantly drawing and drawing upon. It's a map of conflict, not of wars alone, but of shifting baselines of sea levels, 1,000 years of deadly unseen radiation, and mineral exploitation. It's also a map of resistance. Climate change and environmental disasters together pose some of the greatest threats to the livelihood, security, and well-being of Pacific peoples. Communities in low-lying island atolls such as Tuvalu and Kiribati, which are merely 2 to 3 meters above sea level, are particularly at risk from rising sea levels. At the same time, higher volcanic island nations such as Vanuatu are at risk from extreme weather events of ever-increasing intensity, threatening their coastal areas, where most people live. The material and economic damages from environmental climate violence are perhaps, in some sense, relatively easier to quantify. But climate breakdown is also leading to profound cultural loss that may be less straightforward to trace, whether this is loss in the form of everyday lived experiences, skills, customs, songs, stories, or the loss of other intergenerational transmissions of knowledge. In the Pacific, contemporary climate emergencies are rooted in the foundational event of colonialism. In the long 50 years from 1946 to 1996, France, the United States, and the United Kingdom conducted over 315 nuclear tests in French Polynesia, Marshall Islands, in Aboriginal lands in Western Australia, in Christmas Island in present-day Kiribati, and other places. Their combined impacts, people's resistance, and search for justice tell an ongoing story at the intersection of colonial power, environmental violence, and international law. Now, younger generations are taking that fight forward, such as the Pacific students fighting climate change who I met while as an academic visiting the University of South Pacific in Port Vila in Vanuatu in the summer. A refrain in the Pacific is often that we're not drowning, but we're fighting. But what is this fight about? What are its contours? Against whom? And what can be global strategies to actually build coalition and solidarity on this? This is kind of what I'm here to speak about today, and to sort of focus on. Some of the largest carbon major companies in the world have known for a long time about the significant adverse impacts of climate arising from their dangerous industrial activity. Moreover, evidence has come to light to suggest that there has been dishonest portrayal and withholding of information from the public for over 30 years. A recent study that was in the newspaper just a couple of days ago was about a new shift, right, around a kind of weaponization of misinformation, which was about climate denialism in Twitter. This draft study from Brown University found that it's suggesting the substantial impact of mechanized bots in amplifying climate denialist messages that are going around. The study didn't really say, who they can be attributed to, but this is happening every day, right? So this is the kind of the conflict that we're the stage where we're at. I wish to invoke only those theories that might help us and others better understand the demands of justice here. In environmental terms, I call the state of affairs an ecological impunity. Impunity, as Baltasar Garzón, the Spanish jurist, has written, is the absence of justice, an offense against the rule of law and the dignity of victims, second only to the original crime itself. Impunity has come to define the perpetuation of gross human rights violations perpetrated against civilians and citizens where victims are denied the chance to seek justice. ecological impunity extends that definition to include assaults against the environment, such as ecocide, that are yet to be recognized as international crimes. Therefore, a state of ecological impunity is one in which crimes such as ecocide are allowed to continue. But how can architecture and spatial practice work to achieve the broader aim of environmental justice? By fighting impunity and forms of ecological impunity. For us, this is an ethical question about how we can hold ourselves within the limits and ruptures of taking political action. As INTERPRT, we're a group of architects, spatial designers, and researchers that are confronting this question, along with many others, in refracted in all its multiplicities, FutureADIZ, and demands. INTERPRT's work is to take investigations against environmental destruction in various parts of the world. The project is interested in using environmental investigations as a way to organize, to support, and to act against contingent platforms for trying ecocide cases. Remembering that given that ecocide is not yet a crime, there isn't a perfect forum to take this criminal offense to. So we have a double fight to take. Not only is it a state of impunity where there isn't the legal forum, but there isn't the crime to actually address this. So we simultaneously have to develop the crime, to develop the law, but also produce the evidence. And this is necessary because this creates what we could also call like an impunity gap, right? And we have to sort of like fill where that gap is, because where actually law is and how it's implemented or how it might not be implemented. You know, what are its contours and what are these gaps? And these are precisely the matter of, let's say, sort of political action rather than purely sort of legal strategies, right? So as civil society, we must sort of influence or try to bring this kind of change as opposed to leaving it to, let's say, lawyers or politicians. Therefore, as a spatial research group, we're also part of a campaign called Stop Ecocide that was started by the barrister Polly Higgins before her untimely death last year to criminalize ecocide as a 21st century crime. We do so in order to send a direct and distinct message to governments, corporations, courts, and tribunals, including the International Criminal Court, and to the public at large. The term ecocide isn't new. It was coined to describe the widespread use of herbicides such as Agent Orange used by the United States during the Vietnam War. In the 1990s, the International Law Commission, which was tasked after Nuremberg to produce a body of law to protect against crimes such as genocide, set to actually produce what was known as the Draft Code of Crimes Against the Peace and Security of Mankind. In this draft code, in Article 26, recognized environmental destruction as a standalone crime. But this was opposed by 3 countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. And it's in the adapted version of the Rome Statute, which eventually led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court, environmental destruction is nowhere to be seen, other than as a section in Article 8 under war crimes, which has a very high threshold that has never been tested. So ecocide as a peacetime crime, right? Let's say the kind of violence that you know our first map of the Pacific showed is missing. And this is what Polly Higgins' work was all about. And towards this, she submitted an amendment to the Rome Statute at the United Nations in 2010. And since then, with Jojo Mehta, an environmental activist, she set up the Stop Ecocide campaign, whose twin aims is to raise awareness on this, but also to work on amending and introducing a new crime. So for this, we lobby and we participate. So here in the Netherlands, at The Hague, because that's where the ICC is based, but it's also where the Assembly of State Parties of the court meets every December. Now, what's unique about, let's say, international justice and let's say a crime of ecocide is this, right? That it's designed to hold individuals to account. Now, we kind of think about, let's say, in the environmental, it's a climate emergency, so on. Sometimes in an abstract way, right? Like, i.e., it must be, it's humanity is responsible, or humanity is to blame, or again, humanity is suffering, right? But it's not about that. It's about particular people, right? So similarly, as we should shift on sort of understanding, that or sort of rethinking, right? The climate emergency is not something abstract at all. It's also important to focus on, let's say, thinking about, let's say, what kind of criminal responsibilities can be actually assigned, within the, let's say, the legal standards that we have today. And in that sense, a crime of ecocide has a potential, right, to actually be a deterrent. It's possible to take individuals to court and hold them responsible. The prosecution and the investigation process is something else, right? So this is a kind of demanding of justice. It is at the first and foremost to name the crime, to give the crime its true name. But finally, ecocide is also about a kind of earth jurisprudence, right? It's not only about the law in terms of courts and so on. And I'd like to read, a couple of words from Polly, where she writes that when ecocide might be enacted in the future, that it shall protect the rights of the natural world, living systems, the global ocean, biosphere, migrant and indigenous of our earth, current and future generations. So it is a horizon concept, right? Which doesn't mean that it's going to solve everything, right? Just similarly as the International Criminal Court is hardly a perfect system, but the ideas behind it and how it came to be is nothing short of a total miracle, given the kind of geopolitics that we're facing in the 21st century. So ecocide, even though genocide, crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, and war crimes are today recognized as international crimes, ecocide remains a missing crime of our time, the crime of our time. Gathering and examining evidence of ecocide requires a shift in perspective in order to understand conflict as a territorial phenomenon. It also involves re-examining the material transformation of landscapes in ecological terms. But it also involves working with and organizations that work very closely with vulnerable communities. In the next part of my talk, I'll present 3 cases where there's a lively dialogue between evidence and advocacy. We'll take a journey that moves geographically from multiple locations across time, but also through scale. There are no perfect legal forums. In each case that I will sort of share with you today, these are cases where there's ongoing, long-term work, where building an evidence file might be a part of that process of, let's say, seeking justice, as opposed to having a perfect court to take a case to, especially when it comes to criminal justice for some of the reasons that I've outlined before. Finally, these are civil society-led investigations, right, which Eyal Weizman from Forensic Architecture has referred to as a kind of counter-forensics, right? But here it is not only about state violence, but also against corporate crimes. And indeed, ecocide forensics, as we want to describe it, right, allows not only this kind of forensics for an existing legal forum, but it is actually geared towards producing a new forum altogether, a new crime altogether. These were footages that was shared to us by a group of Polish activists who were fighting the Polish state in protecting the forest, one of the oldest primeval forests of Europe, the Białowieża forest, right? These are actually footages that were taken by the activists, where the activists had sort of done a sit-in protest at the forestry department site, but were then taken by the Polish state and accused of criminal offenses, of disturbing the peace and etc. Right. So this is sort of like the beginning of the first case that was, or discussions that we had with the Biennale Warsaw and the Modern Art Museum in Warsaw about sort of the development project there, which is part of a long-term residency that we're doing between these two institutions in Warsaw. And we were thinking that actually a piece of research that we've wanted to do for a long time is actually looking at, well, what are the precedences, right, of actual attempts at prosecutions for international crimes, right, for environmental destruction, where, especially given that ecocide doesn't yet exist. So we produced an exhibition with these two institutions called Race and Forest. And the sort of the premise of the exhibition, which I will sort of explain, which I'll get into a little bit, was looking at to reconstruct the very first attempt, right, of attempts at a prosecution, and this comes from a case called 1307, which was a case that was brought forward by Poland against Germany, at the United Nations War Crimes Commission. This sort of right after after the Second World War, and the UNWCC is a kind of grandmother of the ICC, or kind of international sort of criminal justice sort of courts. And in Poland's around 8,000 cases that they'd submitted, or they were sort of building, Marian Muszkat, who was the main investigator on the Polish prosecution side, right, who went on to work on the Eichmann trial in Israel, sort of highlighted one crime, particularly out of a number of them, called 1307. And this case was a case where Poland accused of German forestry scientists of destroying Polish forests for the Reich, right? This is never something like this had been tried before. And so we reconstructed, right, going through various archives in the UK, just at the Wiener Holocaust Library, but also the Polish National Archives, to actually reconstruct, how this case was put together and what kind of judgments were passed, right, as a kind of very first precedence. The evidence, we also reconstructed the evidence, which included Polish forestry scientists giving testimonies, right, against the Germans. And one of their key arguments was that actually Germans had invented scientific forestry, right, and which was eventually then used by various other colonial powers all over the world. And the Polish sort of forestry scientists, accused the Germans of actually using forestry science as a kind of weapon of war, right. Particularly, the evidence was brought together that we did this very detailed archival research on this one particular gazette called Wald und Holz, right, which was produced by the Germans, on the occupied Poland, the general government, which on a weekly basis, in very detailed prose and with logistically sort of explained, how they're economically and methodologically actually using the sort of taking the forest and turning it into timber and various other products in the war effort. So this also included sort of reconstructing, where this timber was used and how the forest was destroyed, right? And all of this was presented as well. Some of this was presented as evidence in building this case file. What we found from this investigation, that only one person was eventually put on trial and sentenced, who was Yosef Buehler, by the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland, where among a litany of crimes that he was accused of as the head of general government, economic destruction, including the destruction of Polish forests, was part of his charge sheet, right? So the irony of it is this, which was not lost in the Polish context, A, that it was the very fascist Polish state today that has been destroying their forests and using law to go against the activists. And B, on a much broader scale, this was in fact arguably the first and still the last time someone has been actually put on trial for destroying forests, right? We're at a time where the Amazon is burning. We're at a time where massive deforestation, across the world has been taking place, where oil palm plantations, are destroying, tropical forests all over the global south. Yet the case of an environmental crime comes from this archive of the Second World War. But something far more sinister was happening, which was that as we sort of delved into these archives, we started finding sort of essays and articles written by these scientists that worked in occupied Poland, where sort of environmental racism, right, and ethno-nationalism and settler colonialism sort of combine, right? This was an example that we found in the Waldunholz archive, where at the very top, the scientists compare a typical typology of a German factory, which is modern, clean, and efficient, and below compares it to a Jewish factory, which is dilapidated and sort of falling apart and so on, right? So this is sort of like what was sort of happening in the background in these documents. The title of the exhibition, Race and Forest, comes from an article that we found called Race and Forest, where the author sort of describes, right, the occupation of Poland at this time. And this is perhaps a map of occupied Poland during the Second World War that has never been seen before, where rather than showing the conflict in terms of troop movements and sort of political lines and so on, the author redraws a map of a key sort of site of the war in ecological terms, right? So what we see here are in his sort of understanding, sort of climatic lines, right, between the East and the West, of tree species that are Eastern and Western, where he reframes the conflict as a war of the Germanic people against the Slavs, and a war in which the nature-loving Germans would defeat the Eastern peoples, and in a war where nature would be called to fight on the side of the Germans. This is a language that we see today in sort of eco-fascist sort of online sort of sort of presence. And in fact, if you look at the manifesto of, let's say, the person that had killed took part in were perpetrated the Christchurch shootings in New Zealand, was actually writing about sort of ecofascism, right? That the planet is now too full of the pristine nature of Australia or Europe or the United States is being taken over by immigrants and these kind of rhetoric, right? So this was already taking place at this time. What we found is that however, the narrative of the Holocaust was not in these documents, of course, right? So what we found was that if we were to actually locate, the locations of the extermination camps in Poland, they were either all inside or next to forests, right? So this crime of the destruction of forests had something much more sinister happening in the background. This is a piece of research that we did with the Warsaw Biennial in collaboration with the Chełmno Holocaust Museum, where we found that actually there was the first, just to go back here, the very first camp of the Holocaust, Chełmno, on the very top left, was like a laboratory, right? This is where not only the efforts of methods of mass murder were first tried out, right, but also methods of hiding the evidence of crimes. And from the testimony of one of the scientific foresters who worked at the site, we found that, in fact, bodies of victims were turned into dust and used as fertilizer to plant in a secret reforestation program. But these forests, which have been marked in archaeological maps, and talking to archaeologists that were working on the site, are not memorialized, right? They're not part of the memorial. A memorial which is visited every year. Well, I asked this question to the museum that, well, who visits Helmno, right? It's not Treblinka and Auschwitz, which is much more known in the narrative of the Holocaust. And his response was that this camp is the most visitors that he gets at this camp, that they receive at this camp, are Israeli Defense Force soldiers who come there every year en masse as part of sort of their initiation program. So what we did here is where we reconstructed, I'll just show you a very small clip.
Widać tutaj też próbowali tutaj coś nasadzać tutaj z tej strony. W 1944 roku komando
A reconstruction of the forest, which we call living evidence.
Based on the photo interpretation of the 1958 aerial image, the archaeological survey identified 2 forested areas within the camp, both dating as from 1942. Building on the archaeological works and location of existing structures, we undertook a field examination of above-ground evidence in Różewski Forest, using airborne light detection and ranging, or LiDAR, which is the first survey of this kind carried out at the Helmno Forest Camp Holocaust site. The survey generated a precise point cloud-based photogrammetry of tree cover of the area containing the 1942 reforestation areas. If the bones of an unknown number of victims helped the forest grow, then today they are living evidence of the crimes perpetrated here.
The project goes on to then use this LiDAR scanner to actually look underneath the forest floor, to be able to look for the microtopography of the forest and to look for signs of mass graves that might be there. I want to move now to the second case, and it might seem that we're making a big jump geographically and in terms of the context, but I hope you will agree with me that perhaps that is not the case. The violence that's entangled with ecology, settler colonialism, resource extraction, racism are all alive and present. If you speak to anybody in the Pacific, as I've done, and conscientious persons in the Pacific as I have done, they'll tell you about the longest running self-determination conflict that's going on in the region, where people are fighting for the right to self-determination against Indonesia, where the rich forests, one of the largest tropical forests in the world, and that is crucial for climate and minerals, are up for grab. This is in West Papua. To this day, an occupied territory in Indonesia under Indonesian control. The UN logo in this image of protest is crucial here, right? And I think it makes a strong link, right, between let's say the global scale, you know, of the kind of violence that we're speaking about, and very particular demands of people and their social sort of struggles, right? And that UN logo is not there for any reason, right? The UN logo that the West Papuans are sort of showing here in their first self-determination is about the fact that how the UN sort of the decolonization process and actually led to a plebiscite in which the West Papuan people were categorically denied the right to self-determination, under the United Nations rules, which the Indonesia nevertheless today claims as sovereign state. And in a context where the Indonesians basically took the baton of colonialism from the Dutch and carried this forward, right? And it's a situation where the Dutch state refuses to speak out against Indonesia in international forums on the question of Papuan self-determination. In this struggle, mining played a very important, continues to play a very important role. And Rosa Mawand, who's a West Papuan intellectual, in a meeting that we'd organized with her, said, and with the international lawyers for West Papua, said that Grasberg mine, which falls in this fault line of mines that go across the Pacific, was the first weapon, right, against the Papuan people. It's run by Freeport and the Indonesian state, and is the world's largest gold and copper mine together. And it was actually handed over by Indonesia to this mining company while the territory was still under dispute at the UN. So, on the site where we've been working where we've been engaged for many years, we conducted a remote sensing analysis where we in order to fill this gap of actually showing that there had not been really a comprehensive study that shows the cumulative violence, right? This long-term, spatially distributed and temporarily kind of stretched kind of violence that's been happening at this site of the mine since the 70s and the 80s, right? And also it is a site, right, where journalists are not allowed, where it's very difficult to go and, let's say, conduct field work. Remote sort of sensing became a very useful tool in order to sort of to better understand and produce sort of evidence that could actually stand up in a legal context. So what we did here was we sort of thought about satellite data as a kind of an exemplary fashion of, let's say, ecocide forensics, right? As a kind of a CCTV, right? That's sort of looking at the Earth from all around, right? Satellites that were maybe perhaps even deployed in order to understand sort of very benign landscape cover change, right? So it is those same tools that can be actually used to serve or to support environmental justice work. But it's different, right, than how satellites are used in human rights work often, where you see sort of before and after image, or where you see the highest resolution, the better it is, where you could see a pin or whatever, something really, really detailed, right? In this case, what we were in fact interested in was to be able to look at how, let's say, where we could literally kind of materially trace, let's say, how the mine tailing had destroyed forests, right, and the ecology of Papua since the 80s to the present. So what you see here, for example, in red, is sort of healthy vegetation, but what is in yellow and green is not. This work we did we finished in 2015. In 2016, we conducted what is called ground truth in satellite and remote sensing work, where you want to connect, what is happening, at the place to the satellite data as a kind of triangulation of the evidence. Where we worked with the Amungme People's Tribal Council. So one thing I forgot to mention earlier is the land on which this mine is located is the indigenous land of the Amungme and Komoro people. Which is not recognized by the Indonesian government. So these were sort of some of the images from the site. So we were able to work with the tribal people's, Amungme People's Tribal Council, to actually get access to the site. The following year, in 2017, with Polly Higgins, with the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, and with the Spanish jurist Baltasar Garzón, and with the support of the government of Vanuatu, who remains to this day the biggest supporter of Papuan independence in the Pacific and in the world, we organized an exhibition at the International Criminal Court's annual meeting, this time held in New York, where we were going to present the evidence that we'd been collecting, along with testimonies that were being sent to us working with groups like Papuan Voices and Awas Mifi, who work very locally on the ground on, let's say, the violence of oil palm plantations and so on. The idea was that we would organize the very first meeting with the leader of the West Papuan independence movement, would actually be able to sit at a meeting of the International Criminal Court and be able to speak about the violence in Papua. However, our plans were thwarted by the Indonesian government, and the exhibition and the events were blocked, during this time. So we could not actually do any of this work. However, all the exhibition material we gave to the Free West Papua campaign, who are operating out of Oxford, where Benny Wenda, the current leader of the Papuan independence movement, has been exiled and lives, which was then shown at the Labour Party conference 2 years ago. And we're now planning to restage this exhibition in Port Vila in Vanuatu in the summer. In 2018, in order to go back to working on how to on strategies on getting towards a legal case on the mine and the violence, we organized a workshop in Tromsø in Norway with West Papuan leaders, community elders from the Amungme tribe, but also with our colleagues from London Mining Network, Veronica Koman, who's a human rights lawyer who has an Interpol arrest warrant out on her from the Indonesian government right now and is in hiding. But along with our colleagues from the Sami parliament and Sami lawyers, and this was very much what our Papuan friends wanted, was to be able to meet and work with the indigenous sort of colleagues, right, from Europe, from the north. The strategy, the meeting. Well, I'll show you very quickly a couple of seconds of Mama Yosef Alomang, who is a 95-year-old woman who's a Amungme activist who has been fighting against the mine all her life. Who was really amazing that she came to join us, speaking about the work about the situation there.
Before I joined the Free Papua movement.
Oktober, saya punya anak pertama yang buka orang Papua yang ada sembunyi di hutan-hutan itu. Saya punya anak Joanna, umur 5 tahun yang dia meninggal.
My first child, 5 years old, died in the jungle.
Dia mau pesanan di kota Temiga.
Big protest in
Sampai
the city of
Tembagapura.
Temiga until Tembagapura area.
Militer dari pelabuhan sampai di Tembagapura.
It was full with the army.
Mendatangkan melindungi Freeport McMoran, militer Indonesia masuk.
It's just to protect Freeport McMoran, and that's why the
Should say protect, not protest.
A picture painting back then.
Karena jangan sampai punya orang ini nanti bikin apa, jadi mereka palangkan dengan militer,
So
tentara.
that's why they use military to protect their interests.
This is a much longer sort of conversation, but I just wanted to show you very, very quickly a moment of that. The painting that Mama Yosefa referred to is a painting by the Sami artist Brita Marakat Laba, in which there's a confrontation, right, that happens in the north, where Norwegian policemen are flying down like crows and turning into sort of taking human form and fighting the Sami, right? And when Mama Yosefa saw this painting, and she'd never seen the work of, she'd never been to the Arctic or never seen the work of this artist, she took one look and she looked at us and she said, "That's what happened to my people." So this was like a moment, right, where I think like it was really transformative for all of us to sort of be able to spend this time with her. We're right now in this long struggle. We're right now in the process of working on a legal case that sort of brings together a lot of these steps that have been ongoing, and much more needs to be done. Just to give you an example, right? Like in this work, there's no easy resolution at all, which can be really frustrating and to say the least, for even a group like us that are working on the evidence side, not to mention, the everyday violence that people have to live through. This brings me to the last case that I wanted to share with you, which sort of is again a project that's sort of ongoing, and I hope kind of brings together and brings us to a place where we can, before we move to Anya's talk. And this project is called Climate Crimes, and this is a work that we're doing in Ogoniland in Nigeria. It might seem that mining in West Papua or sort of oil pollution in Nigeria isn't directly related to, let's say, the concerns of climate justice, but we would argue that it's in fact the opposite, right? So I mean, on the one hand, this idea of the front line, right, which isn't only about, let's say, a front line that's sort of geographically, at sites of consequences, but it's also where extraction takes place, right? It also follows this logic, that came to us when we were working on the reconstruction of Case 1307, where we saw that, like, in that logic of violence, right? You take environmental racism, you take settler colonialism, and you take resource exploitation and so on. And you're going to end up with if not a genocide that happens all at once, but something that's much more slow motion, right? And which would also term as a kind of ecocide. We're really at a really fertile time, right, where there isn't a definition of ecocide. In fact, one of the worst things, and I put that in quotes, that happened to the legal term genocide, right, was that when it was codified into a legal term, some of the original ideas that Lemkin, who coined the term, was actually left out, such as, we understand today genocide to only include, an attack with an intention to destroy, a particular group based on their ethnicity, or et cetera, right? It's an identified population with the intention of destroying them. So these have to be, all of this has to be really met in order for genocide to be actually recognized, as an international crime, right? But Lemkin's definition also included cultural destruction, as a crime, right? And it wasn't only about, let's say, wiping out a population, to its last person as such, right? So these ideas around, let's say, international crimes are contested as well. So we need to be vigilant, and we need to actually work on how, let's say, from civil society we can actually help shape, let's say, a kind of an architecture of justice, if you would like. The case of Ogoniland and the violence of Shell in Ogoniland should be known to a Dutch audience, right? So perhaps I don't need to go into much detail on this. And many groups, such as Amnesty International, have done amazing work to actually document the crimes of Shell and their collusion and collaboration with the Nigerian state, in Nigeria against the Ogoni people and the oil pollution and violence. What our contribution right now, or what we're working on at the moment, is working with the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, a social movement organization that was founded by Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Ogoni activist who was executed by the Nigerian state in 1996, in order to build an oil pollution sort of database and platform, right, where we can actually work with MOSOP in order to build an advocacy tool that they can use, and also towards building a criminal case. This is all the more important, as I'm not sure if this has been clocked in the Dutch press, but the Nigerian state, have passed laws to go back to Ogoniland to be able to dig for oil again, right? Which they had not been able to do since the MOSOP had successfully fought them to kick them out of their territory. But what of course happened is that the major pipelines from Ogoniland, from Nigeria, sort of, with all the oil, flows through their territory, right? So strategically, this is a very important sort of location, and it's crisscrossed with oil infrastructure that is collapsing, but at the same time that has been for decades causing immense amount of sort of violence against both the ecology and the people. I'll show you very quickly a couple of seconds of some of this work we've been doing. We've been building an oil spill database.
Has been working on behalf of the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people to gather up-to-date spatial evidence of the impacts of long-term oil pollution on the southern Niger Delta. First, we conducted a site analysis to map settlements, roads, public services, water bodies, oil infrastructure, and water wells, among others. Shell maintains a large network of crumbling oil infrastructure and pipelines that crisscross the Ogoni territory, which continues to enrich the company and the Nigerian state while perpetuating ecological harm and human rights violations for the Ogoni people. We used the United Nations Environment Programme survey data and our own satellite imagery analysis to identify and map this toxic infrastructure in order to better understand the sources of pollution. Large sections of pipelines lie above ground and dangerously close to people's homes. Here is a photograph of a section that runs from Eleme Petrochemical Company through Okirika town. Next, we mapped all available data on oil spills covering a period from 1985 to the present day to produce an up-to-date oil spill database. We used available oil spill quantity in barrels to produce a heat map and visualize the areas with a higher amount of hydrocarbons spilled on or near human settlements.
The violence in Ogoniland and responsibility of Shell, in the context of, let's say, an ecocide forensics, must make longer chains of agency, right? I.e., between the elements of crimes, between the act, the mental state, but also the consequence and the context. And in this sense, the work we're doing now is sort of very interested in looking at a new branch of what we might call a new kind of forensic tool, which is around attribution, right? Attribution is about is against this idea of this abstraction of climate destruction, right? Of saying that, well, this is happening and there's no actual responsibility possible to assign to, let's say, specific actions of, let's say, big oil, right? And in this sense, what climate attribution tries to do, and this is work that we're hoping to do with some of the scientists that worked on this report, is to actually connect specific emissions of oil companies to specific climate specific metrics of climate change, such as, let's say, warming oceans, right? And in this next sort of short segment, and we're about to come to a close, we'll just show you, let's say, how we're beginning to do this work. And this has to do with, let's say, the rise in the intensity of storms in the Pacific, let's say, to warming oceans and connecting them to, let's say, the activities of oil companies.
Storm tracks of major cyclones in the South Pacific from 1992 to 2018 show a pattern in the increase of intensity of cyclone strength at a rate of about 9 kilometers per hour per decade. Cyclone Wilma was the first storm to still be classed as a tropical cyclone by the time it struck New Zealand, with 10-minute sustained wind speeds of up to 185 kilometers per hour. Cyclone Winston was the most intense tropical cyclone in the Southern Hemisphere on record, with 10-minute sustained wind speeds of 280 kilometers per hour. Record-breaking sustained winds of 300 kilometers per hour were observed over Koro Island in Fiji. Cyclone Donna was the most powerful off-season Southern Hemisphere cyclone ever recorded in the month of May, with 10-minute sustained wind speeds of up to 205 kilometers per hour.
Just so we can kind of get to the very end, I'm skipping a very last part of that video where we actually show a specific storm, Cyclone Pam, that struck Vanuatu, you know, and the ocean temperature that in relationship to that, and to show that as the storm developed, the ocean temperature was also sort of increasing, right? So these are, in a way, we're not quite there yet, but these are all kind of like pieces of a puzzle, you know, and much more needs to be done to actually bring this data together. But the idea is that in ecocide forensics must actually address these longer chains of agency, you know, which is perhaps, you know, the message that I'd like to sort of share with you. But this work also has to support the leadership or the lead that frontline states and civil society are taking, right? And in this sense, on the issue of ecocide, it could not be any more true. And this is a statement that we work very closely with the government of Vanuatu at the ICC, and this was a statement made at this year's Assembly of State Parties that just finished in The Hague, where Ambassador John Licht sort of is the first statesman at the ICC, you know, to actually speak about ecocide, and in order to sort of push this forward.
The Assembly of State Parties is supremely well positioned to help realize this potential. Most notably, an amendment of the Rome Statute could criminalize acts that amount to ecocide. We believe this radical idea merits serious consideration.
Well, thanks very much for listening. At the very end, I'd like to just say that if anything, much more work needs to happen. This is sort of an ongoing work for us and many others in order to build coalition to support the frontline groups, the civil society, which we are doing. Example in Vanuatu with an NGO called Further Arts. But you also in this struggle, we also need to listen, and we need to listen to the ground and from the ground. And they need to center on the indigenous testimonies and their accounts and so on. And this is why it's important that we find ways of collaborating, working together, and actually using, you know, the different sort of approaches and methods that we have to sort of to take this work forward. And for this, I'm very much looking forward to hearing my good friend Anya's work, who has been a huge kind of inspiration in terms of work in the Pacific. And I hope I haven't taken too long, and hope we can keep this going and to the conversation later. Thank you.